The focus of today's lesson is also on equivalent fractions. So recall what we need to be able to do is to know what it means for two fractions to be the same or equivalent. For example, y is 2/4 exactly the same as a half. And what we want to be able to do is to take a fraction like this and work out how to write it in its simplest form by dividing through by the highest common factor. Couple of introductory activities. Draw a circle divided into 8 parts. There's my 8-part circle. Shade a quarter of the circle. Easy. There's one method. Do that in 3 different ways. Instead of shading that part there, I'm going to change it to that part. There's a second way. Here's a third way. If you want to get a bit more adventurous, split each of the parts into another 2 parts. Make sure the parts are even. And now, that part, that part, that part, and that part. Don't know whether that's cheating a little bit because it says divided into 8 equal parts, but I've done that. But I have shaded a quarter of the circle. So it didn't say you cannot divide it any further. Draw a triangle, divided into 4 equal parts. Easiest way probably to do this is to not draw a triangle, but instead draw a rectangle. There's my triangle. All right, and then what we're going to do is just black out this part here. We don't need it. Okay, and there is our triangle. Yeah, so grab a rubber or whatever you need to and keep this 4-part triangle. Okay, so let's shade that as per the requirements, and what they're looking for us to do is to shade a half of the triangle in 2 different ways. So here's 4 parts, let's shade 1 part and 2 parts. There's half of it, and let's get again a bit creative on this. I'm going to split that in half and split that in half. Shade that, split that in half, shade that, split that in half, and shade that. And there is my half shaded. So what is an equivalent fraction? How would you describe them? Well, here's one thing to note. So you would have seen this before in primary school. It's a fraction wall. And what I can see here is I've got, this one here represents a half. So we're looking for what is the same as a half. Well, these two would be the same size. These are quarters, and I've got 2 of them. So a half is equal to 2/4. What else would it be equal to? Here we go. That's the same size as a half. That's 3/6. 4/8. Have we got any others? 5/10. And 6/12. They're all equivalent fractions, okay? And that's because they make the same fraction, okay? They will produce a fraction of exactly the same size, that a half is the same as 2/4. How do we do this mathematically? Write 4 equivalent fractions for 2/3. So what we're going to do to make an equivalent fraction is use probably something that you've heard in primary school, which is whatever you do to the top of the fraction, you also do to the bottom of the fraction, okay? So if I double the denominator and split this into 6 parts and double the numerator, what I get is a new fraction, which is 4/6. 4/6 is exactly the same as 2/3. Think about it. If I divide something into 6 parts and give you 4 of them, that's exactly the same as dividing the same object into 3 parts and giving you 2 of them. We can do it again. So I can times this by 10 and times this by 10. If I multiply through by the same number, That's 40 parts out of 60. If I divide a cake into 60 parts and give you 40, you're within your rights to tell me, why didn't you give me just 4 parts out of 6? Why did you have to divide it into so many parts? And in fact, you could go further and say, why didn't you just divide the cake into 3 parts and give me 2 of them? Because these fractions are equivalent, and you'd be very correct. Let's do one last one. I'm going to multiply by 100, multiply by 100. That's 40,000 over 60,000. So if I divided the cake into 60,000 parts and gave you 40,000 parts, that would be the exact same thing as giving you 2/3 of the same cake. Right, fill out the missing number in these fractions. So 1/3 is equal to something sixth. So it's the same fraction, but instead of 3 parts, it's 6 parts. I'm going to do that by multiplying by 2. 1 times 2 is 2. So 2/6 is exactly the same as 1/3. Now this one has 4 parts. We have 4 parts, but we don't know how many parts we're split into. So if I multiply 2 by 2 and 6 by 2, I'm going to get 12. 4/12 is the same as 2/6, which is the same as 1/3. All right, when we write fractions in their simplest form, what we try to do is find the highest common factor of the numerator and the denominator. That is the number that goes into 12, but also goes into 20. All right, now ideally it's the highest common factor, but ultimately what you need to do is put a factor in. Okay, so this one here, I can see that both of these numbers are even. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to divide by 2 and divide by 2. Okay, so what does that mean? What I'm going to do is go 12 divided by 2 is 6, 20 divided by 2 is 10. Okay, so I've divided through by a common factor. Now that's really good. I didn't get the highest common factor because note the result has come out as both even numbers. So I'm going to do the same. I'm going to divide by 2 and divide by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3, 10 divided by 2 is 5. Now, some of you will have noted that I could have just straight away divided by 4. That's the highest common factor. 12 divided by 4 is 3, 20 divided by 4 is 5. Notice that the results are exactly the same, albeit if you get the highest common factor, it's much faster. Right, this one here, we're going to note that 7 is a factor of 42 and 7 is a factor of 7. So if I divide this by 7 and divide this by 7, this is where knowing your times tables is crucial. That's going to be 1, and 7 goes into 42 6 times. So 7 on 42 is exactly the same as 1/6. Carla, Myrna, Gabriella are eating pizza. Carla has a quarter of the pizza, Myrna has 2/3 of a pizza, and Gabriella has 1/6 of the pizza. Okay, who has the most pizza? So we've got 2/3, we've got 1/6, and we've got a quarter. Now maybe you can do this by visualizing it, but what we want to do is prove it. Okay, I don't want diagrams. Okay, I want calculations. Right, so I can probably see that whoever ate 2/3, who was it? Myrna ate the most pizza, followed by, who ate a quarter? Carla, followed by Gabriella. But I want to kind of prove it. So what I'm going to note here is in the denominators, I can find an equivalent or a number that all of these go into. So that's going to be 12. I'm going to multiply this by 3, multiply this by 2, and multiply this by 4. Now, to make equivalent fractions, you do or multiply or divide the denominator by the same amount. So I'm going to do the same thing to the denominator. Now, what we've got is 8 parts out of 12 for Myrna. We've got 2 parts out of 12 for Gabriella. And we've got 3 parts out of 12 for Carla. So we can quickly see here that Myrna she ate the most, 8 parts out of 12. Gabriella ate the least. And right in the middle there was Carla. She ate 3 parts out of the 12. So equivalent fractions allows us, or building equivalent fractions allows us to quickly compare and really justify which is the largest and which is the smallest. All right, so now on to exercise 4B, and if you finish or when you finish that activity, get on to this one here.